So yeah, the Autumn Sustainability Celebration is a tribute to the growing community of sustainability-minded students, faculty, and staff at the University of Toronto. It's hosted by the Committee on the Environment, Climate Change, and Sustainability, or CECCS, and it's made possible through a generous donation from Wendy Adams. The purpose of this event series is to celebrate successes, inspire new activities, build relationships, and collaborate campus engagement around sustainability. So in order to ensure that the event does run smoothly, we are asking that we as a community hold each other accountable for maintaining a space of safety, accountability, respect, and inclusion. If there are any inappropriate verbal or written communication, which I hope is not the case, those individuals will be removed from the session. So without further ado, today's roundtable discussion is a student-initiated discussion. It was brought forward by the campus group Leap U of T, which has been one of the main forces behind the push for divestment at the University of Toronto, especially in more recent years. My name is Amanda Harvey Sanchez, and I will be the moderator today. I'm a Latina organizer, researcher, and educator. I was born and raised in Toronto, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD here at the University of Toronto in sociocultural anthropology and environmental studies. I work with grassroots activists in the city of Toronto and across Canada on creative solutions to the climate crisis towards socio-ecological transformation. I'm also the graduate representative on the Committee for the Environment, Climate Change, and Sustainability here at U of T. Today's discussion is especially close to my heart because it was when I was an undergraduate student here at U of T that I actually first got involved in climate justice organizing through the divestment campaign around 2014, 2015. And that was the beginning of what would be a lifelong commitment to climate justice organizing. As a settler working in the climate justice movement, I'm also committed to doing my part to forward decolonization, including and especially through the rightful return of land to Indigenous governance across Turtle Island. It's in that spirit and commitment that I will be offering a land acknowledgement. But first, for those who may be joining us from outside Toronto, I just want to drop a link in the chat. 1 second. Or if someone has it handy, I was just going to drop the link to nativeland.ca.
I've just put it in.
Thank you so much. So for those who may be joining us from outside Toronto, you can visit nativeland.ca to find more information on Indigenous territories, languages, and treaties from wherever you may be currently located. So for those of us in Toronto, the land on which the University of Toronto operates has been occupied and cared for by diverse Indigenous nations since time immemorial. This land is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I offer my gratitude to these nations and any other nations, recorded and unrecorded, who have diligently cared for this land. While a land acknowledgement is a moment of pause and gratitude, for settlers like myself, it should also be a wake-up call to remember how it is historical and ongoing Indigenous dispossession that allows us to be here today. Toronto is the site of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. As we begin our discussion today on fossil fuel divestment and what comes next, I invite all of us to reflect on the teachings of this treaty and how it might inform our work going forward. Further still, I want to invite fellow settlers in particular to consider how the imperative of Indigenous calls for land back invite us to develop new, socially just, and ecologically sustainable relations with land, water, and people. So the format for today's discussion is going to be as follows. First, I will provide a very brief introduction to divestment and introduce our speakers. And then the rest of the event is going to be more of an interactive, personal and conversational roundtable discussion organized around a few key themes. The first theme is why divestment. The second theme is what U of T divestment means. The third theme is what was left out of the recent announcement. And then the fourth and final theme will be what comes next. And there may be some overlap between all of these themes. And then we'll close with about 25 to 30 minutes for audience Q&A. So please do stick around for that. So the movement for fossil fuel divestment is global, but here at U of T, student efforts to push for fossil fuel divestment began way back in June of 2012. And it was not until October of 2021 that the university committed to divest its endowment from fossil fuel companies. So today we're really celebrating the generations of students, faculty, and staff who made this commitment, this victory possible. Still, that being said, the work of divestment and of climate justice more broadly is far from over, and that is a big part of why we're here today. I am so pleased to welcome four speakers who each bring really unique perspectives on fossil fuel divestment, what it means, and what might come next. I'll offer just brief introductions because I hope that the speakers will also introduce themselves in the first theme and weave that a bit into their responses. But really pleased to welcome Rivka Goetz, who is a fourth-year undergraduate student and an organizer with LEAP U of T, the group that initiated this discussion. Patrick DeRoshi, who is Senior Manager at Shift Action for Pension Wealth and Planet Health. Dr. Matthew Hoffman, who I hope will be joining us soon. He's a professor in political science and a member of the Student Faculty Staff Coalition, Divestment and Beyond. And Rebecca Sinclair, who's the Research and Policy Analyst at Indigenous Climate Action. So the first theme, which will take us around 10 or 15 minutes, is why divestment? So please feel free to respond to that, how feels comfortable to you. And I'm also asking, because it's the first question, that each speaker introduce themselves briefly in your response and tell us a bit about personally why divestment for you. And maybe we can start with Rivka.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Rivka, as Amanda said. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a fourth-year undergraduate student here at U of T. I also want to thank the University of Toronto, as well as the CECCS committee, for the opportunity to have this conversation as part of the Adams Sustainability Celebration. I think it's really important that we continue the conversation around divestment and the work that's been done and the work that is still going to be done looking forward by staff, faculty, students, and community members outside of the university, like some of my fellow panelists today. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Like I said, I'm a fourth-year undergrad. My major is critical studies in equity and solidarity. I'm also minoring in Spanish and diaspora and transnational studies. And I have been a climate justice organizer for all of my undergrad, so starting in September of 2018, starting before the pandemic, back when we could hold rallies and climate strikes, and then moving through online organizing and moving to a more online education-based raising awareness of divestment and climate justice as part of LEAP U of T. LEAP U of T is a grassroots student activist group. Our main focus has been the fossil fuel divestment campaign since the group started in late 2016, but we also see divestment as part of a much broader vision for what climate justice looks like. So that includes solidarity, decolonial climate justice, anti-capitalist climate justice, and looking at the marginalized communities that are most impacted by the climate crisis and how we can center those voices in our calls for divestment and our calls for what it looks like to build a just transition to a greener future more broadly. So really excited to talk about all of that. Now that we have won this really important victory at the University of Toronto, there is a lot of room to push further and use our privilege and power that we have as such a major Canadian institution to continue to call for further action for climate justice. So for me, coming as a first-year undergraduate in the fall of 2018, I knew nothing about divestment. I barely knew what investments were. I mean, I did, but I didn't really understand the role that played in any sort of activism or in the climate crisis. So I met several older students who had already been organizing with LEAP U of T for a few years, and part of LEAP U of T's mission is to be educating and starting these conversations about divestment. So I was able to learn pretty quickly the role that that U of T played as not just an academic institution, as an educator, but also as an investor and a social institution. So for me, and what I've learned in the last few years as an organizer with LEAP, is that divestment is really about a social license. So we do, consider the money and the environmental and financial aspects of it, but the main goal for me, and what I am really proud of U of T for accomplishing this year with its commitment to divest the endowment from the fossil fuel industry, is that we are pushing our society, our economy, and our culture away from a reliance on fossil fuels and into that just transition that we need to build a future that does not continue giving power and giving license to these companies to keep extracting the natural resources of our land, and if here in Canada, of Indigenous land that has been stolen and unoccupied for thousands of years. So yeah, I think that sort of gives a brief overview. I know we're going to be moving more in depth with conversations later, so I'm really excited to hear what everyone has to say. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rivka. Patrick, would you like to go next?
Sure, I can jump in, and thanks a lot for having me today. I'm not directly a part of the U of T community, but I have been following the fight that's been happening at U of T for years now. We've only been at it with pension funds for a few years now, so I really take a lot of inspiration from folks, staff, faculty, and students at U of T that have pushed so hard for fossil fuel divestment for years now. I'm the senior manager of Shift Action for Pension Wealth and Planet Health, or SHIFT for short. We track the fossil fuel investments and climate-related policies of Canadian public pension funds and organize and mobilize beneficiaries of those funds to push them to do better on climate, to get fossil fuels in the portfolio, and to invest in a climate-safe future. And for me, I really think that I come at this work first and foremost from a moral perspective. I think it's wrong for universities to be investing their endowment funds and their other financial resources in companies that are destroying the planet in the future for the students that go to those universities. And for pension funds, I think it's wrong for them to be investing in companies, projects, and infrastructure that are undermining the retirement security and a stable climate for their own beneficiaries. So I really put that as top line for the reason I've been doing this work. But I do come at this work as well as someone who's worked on climate and energy policy at the federal and provincial level for years before this. And I see pension funds and endowment funds and other big asset managements as a real lever for change, to directly remove the social license of the fossil fuel industry to operate, and to drastically reduce emissions at scale. So just on those direct impacts, there is empirical evidence that divestment announcements and commitments reduce the share prices of fossil fuel companies, that they're driving up the cost of capital for fossil fuel companies to expand their operations and their infrastructure, and that companies that are targets of divestment campaigns actually reduce emissions faster than those that are not. So I think there's some real world direct impacts to this movement and the reason we do it. And then just on that social license piece, I think that by targeting these big banks, pension funds, endowment funds, we're creating the policy space for governments to move faster. Obviously, folks in this call and others have been calling for years to drastically cut emissions, with limited success in Canada and around the world. But I think it's a lot different when a huge asset manager or a bank or a pension fund is saying the same things and moving in that direction. Then it creates the policy space for governments to come in and put in place the regulations and laws and policies we need to actually reach our climate targets. So I think it's a very important and powerful tool and lever for action on the climate. And just in the work that we do on pension funds, we are looking at the 10 or 11 largest public pension funds in the country, and that's about $2.1 trillion in assets under management. So if we can actually shift even a small percentage of those assets out of fossil fuels into climate solutions, that's a dramatic shift in accelerating the energy transition away from fossil fuels. So I just want to put it out there as it's a really important lever for transformative economic change.
Amazing. Yeah. Let's move to Rebecca to introduce herself and provide a response, and then continue the discussion.
Hansaya Sawe Muskwa Squeen is Hassan, a Chinida Barrenlands First Nation. and Little Saskatchewan First Nation. Little Saskatchewan First Nation. My mom's side of the family comes from Barrenlands First Nation, and my dad's side of the family comes from Cross Lake First Nation in Slovakia. My husband is from Little Saskatchewan, and that's where me and my children and my husband are now registered and care for quite deeply. I have the new Director of Education and Programming at ICA, formerly the Research and Policy Analyst, working on decolonizing climate policy. Thank you guys for having me here today. It is, just word of warning, it is spring break, so my kids are home. I have 3 and they're generally wander around and make a bunch of noise and do not care that I do this kind of stuff for a living. So why divestment? I think like this kind of question is so nuanced for Indigenous folks that it comes beyond just our working or our careers or, you know, our lives are so embedded in the inherent responsibility to the land and that relationship to the land. So when we look at any given thing, we're looking at this big picture. We're looking at the effects and the really looking at how all of these things are interconnected and interplayed and together that contribute to the dispossession of our land and the dispossession of our sovereignty. So I always think about like I guess when we look at money, we look at power, look at white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, and all of these things are interconnected. When we talk about this in policy, we're looking at the just transition as our other speakers have kind of talked about too, right? I think I'm not directly involved with the U of T's fossil fuel divestment campaign, but there are ways that ICA has been looking at what divestment means. Just link in the chat here, No More Dirty Banks, in which one of our co-founders, Melina Lubicon Massimo, is working on with quite a number of celebrities on divesting from RBC and the City National Bank. I think when we look at what it means for a just transition, what it looks like for climate policy, what it looks like for climate change, we really need to start looking at the economics of that and how we're investing our money and divesting our money from this conversation. But I have like a love-hate relationship with education right now, in the sense that like I'm very particular about my my bio that I had put out. I pursued a Bachelor of Environmental Studies, which was incredibly nauseating. And so I didn't complete. I am 1 class shy, 3 credit hours shy of completing a Bachelor of Environmental Studies because I've actually failed environmental economics twice. And I find this like a good talking point, because it really looks at the model of what our current economic system is at and how that's so fundamentally different from what Indigenous worldview looks at in terms of like how we care for this planet and how we move forward in a good way. And not to say that Indigenous people didn't have economic systems, but they weren't rooted in this idea of money, power, and supremacy. So that's kind of what brought me into this conversation today. And like ultimately the work that I do, though it's like a job, it's still like an inherent responsibility to me. Thinking of my 7 generations ahead of me and 7 generations behind me. So that's the responsibility that I have on my shoulders. I'm going to stop talking here because I'm better at response to questions. And it's kind of early and it's, you know, spring break for me. So I'm like just sipping on my coffee. So I really do appreciate being here today. Agosane.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I also, I just want to note that we have a few actually people in the audience who are faculty members from Divestment and beyond. So I just want to mention if Matt is unable to join us, we may, if they're comfortable, have the possibility to hear a bit from the faculty side there, but no pressure. So you know who you are. Please let me know if you'd like to step in. But with the time remaining we have in this theme, I'm really intrigued by what many of you said around moral license, around the policy space, around economics. And I mean, divestment and, you know, politics more broadly is really about the art of what is possible and changing what is imaginable and what is possible. And I really think divestment did that, right? Like we saw that with the president's announcement. It was mimicking activist language. It was adopting our language that we had put forward when years prior, the president had rejected that very frame. So I think that shows the power of divestment there, but I wonder if the question of why divestment has perhaps also changed for people who worked on this campaign. So I think there was, you know, success in pushing forward our framing, but did our framing change at all? Did the motivation for divestment develop for you in the process of working on this from your various, you know, community and institutional capacities?
I can speak to that a little. I mean, I think of everyone on this call, or at least on the panel, I've probably been involved in the divestment movement for the shortest period of time, since it's just been the 4 years of my undergrad. But even just in that time, I think with the pandemic, as well as just the broader recognition that the climate crisis as an actual emergency has started to receive here on Turtle Island as well as worldwide. I think that, you know, we have seen a sort of widening of the scale of what divestment means as a smaller piece in a bigger puzzle. So when I first started organizing with Leap U of T, we were really just focusing on the university scale. And of course, I mean, we still are in some ways. We're still very much a campus group looking at U of T and our position as students, and the university's position and the investments that it does have, like limited to the University of Toronto. But I think in the past 4 years, we have also seen this start to sort of snowball into a much larger conversation. So that has involved things like joining the Divest Canada Coalition, which includes universities across so-called Canada that have their own divestment movements, some of which have been successful, like U of T's, some of which are still calling on their university to recognize the urgency of divestment and the necessity of that. So there's, you know, we started to have these larger conversations and across borders as well, looking at schools in the US and across different continents too, having these conversations not just about our own schools and our own, you know, specific endowments, pension funds, but also about what it means to, you know, adopt a climate justice lens in all of our climate policies. So I think, yeah, if anything, the conversation has just gotten bigger, and I hope it will continue to do so.
Yeah, I can't speak directly to the divestment and beyond fight at U of T, but I would say, and I kind of mentioned this in the intro, is that it really is important to see this kind of avalanche of divestment announcements from universities that started as a trickle years ago that are now really opening the floodgates on that. It really does create the social space and political space to demonstrate what's possible. And I think it's starting to trickle down into kind of mainstream large asset managers now. But we've seen about $40 trillion US now that has some form of screen on fossil fuel investments around the world, is becoming increasingly normalized and mainstream. And I think that it really started with universities and cultural institutions as that trickle, and now it's becoming a flood. And then the other thing I think has happened in the process of divestment campaigns is we're actually changing the minds of the people that are overseeing these assets, that are managing these portfolios. We're raising questions that they've never asked before and they've never even considered before. They're kind of unknowns to them. So even just kind of by bringing these perspectives into their orbits and changing the way they think, they might be really good at managing traditional financial risks, but climate change is not a traditional financial risk. And campaigns like Divestment and Beyond have really helps to force those managers, those investment managers, to reckon with the scale of the crisis and think about what they do and how it impacts that crisis and the speed with which we try to stop it. And I'll just jump in there as well with the U of T divestment in particular, and as well as the University of Guelph. And I'll talk about this a bit more after with some slides I'll show, but with these universities committing to fossil fuel divestments, it puts the new university pension plan, which U of T faculty and staff are now members of, in a difficult position to refuse divestment, because we can say your university has already done this with your endowment funds. Why can't we hold you to the same standard? Why can't you honor that commitment in your pension fund as well? So I think that the work we're doing on pensions and the work you folks are doing on endowments go hand in hand and can really reinforce each other and support each other over time.
Like Patrick, I can't speak directly to the U of T's divestment campaign, but I think when we think about divestment and like the work that we put into this kind of activism, I think I come at this from a bit of a pessimistic kind of model, in the sense that we see divestment happen, like for example, with Russia and Ukraine. We see how fast people are to move their money out of things that they perceive is wrong or morally wrong. But we don't see that same sort of kind of action here in Canada for our sacred earth. We don't see that same sort of action here in Canada for Indigenous folks. So divestment to me means a lot in terms of what like the criminalization of Indigenous folks that are protecting the land. With Wet'suwet'en, it also like means to me, like, what does that mean in terms of actual lives saved for murdered missing Indigenous women in Canada? So these things are so interconnected, and I do apologize because I do come at this from a very pessimistic model, right? When we see change, I'm gonna use land back as an example too, or not land back, like land acknowledgements in Canada. I was very like on the fence about land acknowledgements, and I was struggling to understand like how this was going to make significant change when people just speak to this and not put action to this. And I remember listening to Nigon Sinclair at the University of Manitoba, who was talking about the very first time he had heard a land acknowledgement, and like how this trickled across so-called Canada and then nationally. And how exciting it was to hear that people's mindsets were being put aside to even think about Indigenous land sovereignty, and that was part of that social change. So for Indigenous folks, we have these small victories, and in the grander scheme of things, there's still so much work that needs to be done. So I appreciate that these big money wheelhouses like universities are starting to consider what that looks like externally, but internally too, that work needs to be done. And so, like I always say, when people talk to me about divestment, I'm always like, okay, but like, let's invest in other things. So sure, the conversation is divestment, but the next steps needs to be, what are we investing in? And with that power model of money and control, what does that mean for Indigenous folks? Does that mean more perpetuation of false solutions, dispossession of land, or these tiny victories? So those are some of the things that come to my mind when I think of what does divestment mean.
Amazing, and that's actually a perfect transition into our second theme, which really is, what does it mean? We have the why divestment, but what does it mean when a public institution like U of T, but also like other churches, universities, now we have a lot of divestment campaigns around banks and pensions. So what does it mean when they do divest? So I'd like to open the floor to discuss that. And then maybe we can start with the speakers we have here, and then Professor Paul Downs has also graciously offered to fill in ad hoc for Matt Hoffman. So I'll invite first Rebecca, Patrick, and Rivka, and then we can have Paul jump in and get a bit of the faculty perspective as well.
Sure, I'm happy to go first if anyone else wants to start though, please do let me know. I think I really actually want to echo what Rebecca said. I mean, I think in some ways it is a pessimistic perspective to look at the ways that divestment does fall short of what we actually need and to build the future that we want. But I think that's also like essential to the work that we're doing, at least from my perspective and the perspective of a lot of other student activists I work with. We divest makes a really great slogan. It makes a really tangible goal. We can look at this October 2021 announcement and say, this is a victory. This is a good thing that U of T is divesting its endowment. It's a great like sort of rallying point for things like the Divestment and Beyond Coalition or the Divest Canada Coalition. But I think it is really, really important in the work that we do to see that that's not the full picture, and that's not the full story of I mean, how systems that are built on the power of capital work, right? So it's not I totally agree that it's not just about taking money out of extractive industries. It's about putting that money into places that are going to build real solutions and build care for each other and for the land that that I as a settler occupying. I think it's not just about, okay, we need to stop hurting the land. It's also about how do we start healing it and healing those relationships with each other and between our communities. So yeah, I think that looking at reinvestment is a really important next step. I know the UBC student divestment campaign has done a lot of work on reinvestment, and I'm hoping that now that we have gotten this commitment from U of T, that's something that the campaign at U of T can look towards as well. And I think what's really important about the signification of like what it means that U of T has committed to divestment is it shows that there is, Patrick mentioned this sort of growing from a trickle to this like wave of universities announcing divestment. Really the cultural conversation is coming to realize that there is no responsible or sustainable or healthy way to remain invested and engaging with oil, gas, and coal companies. There's no way of persuading them or altering that relationship to leverage it in any way. There's no good, positive, sustainable way to continue those connections. The only way forward, if we are going to do something about the climate crisis in time, is to take that money out and take that power away from the industry. So instead of relying on previous systems or things like ESG standards, self-reported measurements of sustainability that we've seen from previous investment policies, the significance of divestment is really showing that we need to be looking in other directions. So it's definitely just a first step. It is not the full picture, even though it can make a nice like catchy slogan or something. Divestment is just the first step, and the next steps have to be, okay, we've taken that away. Now where are we going to put that power instead? And yeah, I think that's where we're looking next for LEAP as a group.
I think it's really important to even stop and think about how we're getting ahead of ourselves with divestment, with just transition and reducing GHG emissions. Like these things are very important, but what are the implications and the realities that Indigenous and marginalized communities have to face when we start to say, put the tax on like we're all experiencing high fuel costs right now, right? So what does that mean for Indigenous communities? We see an increase in infrastructure costs. We see an increase in food and an increase in food insecurity in the north and in flying communities. So I always think about like, yes, divestment is the thing that we're striving for, but before we get to that point, are we looking at this conversation from a privileged standpoint? Are we looking at this from a point where we can take transit, where we can buy electric vehicles, we can have access to the finances that are needed. I always think about my grandma before I went to COP 26 in Glasgow. I was like, if I meet Trudeau, what do you want me to say to him? And she goes, tell him my pension's too small. And we laughed and we giggled about that, but like, what does that really mean in the grand scheme of things? And like, how does that affect my kugum? And somebody that has been on the land her entire life, has been taking care of this land in her entire life, and not even thinking like, my kugum doesn't go, yeah, I'm a land steward. That's just her life. And the deficits that she's had to live on will only continue to grow when we start to talk about what divestment actually means and when those people are in power or structures of power and white supremacy, that stuff is not going to go away easily or quietly into the night because we champion around or we rally around new terms like divestment. So I always think about, like, yes, reduce emissions. This is what we're all here for, but what are those implications and how do they affect marginalized communities, even in this conversation? So we have a goal in mind of what we look for when we start these social justice movements, but oftentimes we're not thinking about this bigger picture of like what the cause and effect are. In Anishinaabe culture, there is, and I'm not familiar, sorry, with this ceremony, but I overheard the ceremony, and it was like eye-opening to me when they had talked about the spider web of policy and the spider web of understanding like how things are so interconnected, and at the center there is spirit, and how we need to be making sure that one thing that we do will ripple into how other people have felt this or other areas have felt this. So I always bring that back into the conversation, not just with divestment, but with just transition. So I know my community, Barren Lands First Nation, Roche, Manitoba, is really feeling the effects of these higher fuel prices at a greater cost than I think those that are privileged enough to be able to, purchase this and that, or be able to take transit and so forth. Like, the food insecurity in my community is incredible. I also grew up in a small abandoned mining community called Lynn Lake, Manitoba, who's feeling the effects of a water crisis. The water is completely, you can't even bath in it anymore. You can't wash your clothes in it. Absolutely nothing. So what does that mean for the plans of infrastructure for that town, and how to be able to move past this when, we can't even afford the fuel prices to get the stuff there. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I totally agree with what's been said already by Rivka and Rebecca on those, on the social points of divestment and reinvestments. But kind of the sandbox that Shift often plays in with the pension funds is purely on a financial level. Obviously, we talk about the moral and ethical reasons for divestment and reinvestments, and that's how we identify beneficiaries and organize them, and obviously agree with them. But the sandbox we really play in is on climate-related financial risk. And for me, I think when a big asset manager or endowment fund or a pension fund makes a divestment announcement, they're saying that these companies, this industry, is too risky to be held in my portfolio, that this company, this industry can't exist in its current form in 10 or 20 or 30 years, that these will become stranded assets, that my portfolio is better off. The returns will be greater, or at least have no negative impacts without them in my portfolio. So it really is just saying that it's too financially risky to continue to invest in it. I think that's a really important point for the community that actually manages these investments. On the reinvestment side, I really struggle with this question when it comes to pension funds, because their sole mandate by law is to maximize returns for beneficiaries, to invest in their best long-term interests. And I have difficulty trying to push the social change, the economic change, the cultural change we need into that small definition. We have examples of pension funds investing in companies that are making housing unaffordable, that are violating Indigenous rights, that are exploiting labor and the real estate that they own, for example, and the companies that they own. And it's not always clear to me how addressing those problems is completely aligned with their mandates to maximize financial returns. I think in the long term, obviously, we need to move in that direction, but I think part of our work is getting those people to realize that there is a benefit to kind of sharing the wealth and to addressing these social problems that are associated with their investments. The only one I can think of it as an alternative example is the Caisse de Placement de Québec, which is the manager of the Quebec pension plan, where they have a dual mandate, where they actually are legally obligated to advance Quebec's economic development. And there's no other example really in Canada of a pension fund that has that mandate. So I really think this question gets to the point of reconsidering the mandates of these funds on what retirement security is for their own members and beneficiaries. And it might look like a democratization of these funds. A lot of times, the big labor unions are involved in the governance structures of these funds. They have thousands of members who are members of the funds. They often appoint board members to the funds. They have some say in trying to direct the investment policies and approach to responsible investing of these funds. And I think there needs to be a lot more work done to see the values and interests of these labor unions and members who are beneficiaries of these pension funds to be reflected in their investments. And obviously that would lead us into a direction of better labor rights, Indigenous reconciliation, reducing inequality, addressing climate change, doing all those things we need to do to build a better society. And I think it's going to take a real reconsideration of our financial system and of the pension funds that are investing what are our retirement savings. So I don't really have all the answers there, but totally agree with like the direction of movements that was expressed by Rivka and Rebecca there.
Paul, would you like to jump in now?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. My name is Paul Downs. I'm a professor in the English department at U of T, and I'm involved in the Divestment and Beyond group. So thanks for letting me say a couple of words. I just wanted to pick up on something that's already been said. I do think that the broader picture, as Rebecca mentioned it, is important here, because I think that some of the resistance that we have found to divestment from the fossil fuel industry, it does have to do with protecting a particular relationship with the fossil fuel industry, but it also has to do with protecting secrecy around investments more generally. I think there's a mindset in the investing world and in the world and in other areas that says it's absolutely imperative to protect the secrecy of investments in order to give our members their pensions. And on the one hand, we recognize the importance of that. Rebecca mentioned her grandmother saying her pension was not big enough. Pensions are vital to people. But on the other hand, this culture of intense secrecy around investments has to be challenged. It's a way of protecting people from their own consciences. It's as if we don't want each other to think about where our pensions are coming from. And as Patrick has mentioned, there are all sorts of ways in which investments are built on the backs of other people's suffering. And the fossil fuel divestment movement is about the climate crisis, but it's also about the larger question of the ethics of investment, and transparency is key. So as part of our work in the Divestment and Beyond movement, we've been very focused on language around transparency in pension and endowment funds. We don't see any reason why these investment funds should not be more transparent about who they're invested in, where their money is coming from, and reporting those investments to members on a regular basis. The other thing that we've been very concerned about is how good managers, administrators, employers, investment fund managers are at appearing to be giving ground on divestment while really giving up very little. So if you look at the U of T divestment that we've mentioned today already, if you look at the actual language of President Gertler's announcement about divestment, one of the things he announced was this. He said, and by the way, this is after he uses such language as existential crisis, global threat, to refer to the climate crisis. And then he announces that U of T will commit to achieving net zero carbon emissions associated with the endowment portfolio by 2050. And it's very important that we look at every single aspect of a phrase like that. What does net mean in net zero? Why do people use the word net constantly? We all need to ask, what do they mean by net? Because that's a crucial part of this language. Secondly, what does it mean to say emissions associated with the portfolio? What does the phrase associated with mean? I would suggest that that's obfuscating language that's meant to hide the fact that they're not really committing to anything very deliberate. And finally, by no later than 2050, what does it mean to call something an existential crisis for the planet and then commit to do something about it by 2050? Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't anything to be pleased about in the university's endowment. It was the work of a lot of pressure, especially from students over many years. But we really have to be very aware of how minimal the announcement was that President Gertler made. It was the most minimal that they could give in order to try and keep certain people quiet. And we have to remember that at every step and push back. We have to push back on the language, we have to push back on the commitments, and we have to push back on this larger question of transparency around where our investments are.
Thank you so much, Paul, for jumping in with that. And I'm so excited hearing this conversation develop between all four of you. We are going to move into the next theme, which I think we've already started talking about, which is what was left out. And that might bleed also into the last theme. We could kind of just combine them, like what was left out and what comes next. And I just want to mention too, because of this topic of democratization that has come up, I know McGill University, I think, is right now still students are doing a sit-in at their university around divestment. And I remember back when I was working on the divestment campaign and we got the rejection in 2016, an administrator had accidentally copied us on an email where they were instructing to keep the president's doors shut because McGill was experiencing a sit-in and we wouldn't want something like that here at U of T. And so they wanted to lock us out, right? And now McGill, their messaging right now is divest, decolonize, and democratize. So to see that question of democratization now come into divestment is really, really exciting. I mean, I'm the only graduate representative on this committee. What does that mean for democratization and who has a say in these types of decisions? So I think just to kick off this kind of last half of the conversation, I'm going to invite Patrick to share some slides because part of what was left out, of course, is pensions. And that's an area where Patrick brings a lot of expertise. So I'll invite him to share some slides and then we can all jump into a broader discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I wasn't quite sure when in the presentation we were going to get to this, and I think we covered some of it, so I'll try to go through this quite quickly. So I think you're already aware of what Shift's doing based on what we talked about already, but we are doing kind of comprehensive campaigns on organizing, monitoring the investments of pension funds, research and analysis into climate policies and approach to climate change and fossil fuel investments. We're organizing beneficiaries. We're doing a lot of public communications work to amplify our work and reach more supporters. That includes digital campaigning. And now we're even doing some work on policy development and government relations to try and change provincial and federal sustainable finance laws in order to accelerate this process away from fossil fuels and shine a light on what the financial sector is doing on climate change. These are the pension funds that we're focused on. They're Canada's 10 largest. And then of course, we also have a campaign with the University Pension Plan now with a really keen and committed group of faculty and staff from U of T, Guelph, Queen's, and Trent. You can see at the top, there's the Canada Pension Plan, which we're all members of outside of Quebec, over $500 billion now in assets under management. The Quebec Pension Plan managed by the CDPQ is also quite huge. And then you can see going toward some of the smaller public pension funds in Ontario, like OP Trust, IMCO, and HOOP. We're really running full campaigns on only a few of these: Ontario Teachers, HOOP, and OMERS, just because of the capacity we have as an organization. There's only 3 of us, but we are tracking the investments of all of these funds. And just to note a couple of examples of this conversation, AIMCO, for example, the Alberta Public Pension Manager, they're not just holding shares in TC Energy. You've already probably all heard of the Coastal GasLink pipeline that they're trying to construct across BC. They actually own the pipes. They partnered with a New York private equity firm called KKR last year in 2020 to buy a 65% stake in the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which of course is going to blow Canada's and BC's climate targets and is actively undermining Indigenous rights to try to build it. So that's just one example of direct ownership by Canadian pension funds of fossil fuel infrastructure. And I'll give the other example as well of the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan here. Their vice chair of investments is also sitting on the board of Enbridge. And we've done some research to analyze some of the corporate entanglements between the Canadian pension funds and the fossil fuel sector, and discovered a lot of different entanglements between corporate directorships, between management, executive staff of these funds, and positions with fossil fuel companies. So we think that there's a potential conflict of interest issue here, but we're not sure if the people overseeing these pension funds are looking out for the best interests of their beneficiaries or for the best interests of the fossil fuel companies on whose boards they sit. So I just wanted to show that slide to give you a sense of just how big in scale these funds are. We talked about this already about why we're doing this work. For one thing, we think public pensions are actually at risk from the climate crisis. Workers' retirement security is at stake. We think that the mass scale of these pension funds is critical to aligning their investments with the safe climate future, investing in the economic transformation we need to see. We think is morally wrong. I think that's been made quite clear. These Canadian pensions are very influential globally, so we think that we can shift the broader global financial sector if we get these big funds in Canada to move. Millions of Canadians are beneficiaries, so there's a big organizing potential there, and it means anybody can use this lever for climate action that they typically might not think about. And of course, pension funds have a long-term investment horizon where they are responsible to the 85-year-old that's been collecting a pension for 20 years, but they're also responsible to the 25-year-old who might have just started paying into their pension fund very recently. Some of our key asks, so we want to see a public commitment to alignment with the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees, planning to decarbonize by 2040 or earlier, and with short-term targets and pathways to get there. An immediate screen on new oil, gas, and coal investment in a phase of current investments by 2025. You've probably heard a lot about pension funds engaging the companies in their portfolio to improve their environmental behavior. We want to see them actually doing that. We don't think that that's mutually self-exclusive with divestments, but we actually need to see them forbidding companies or portfolios from lobbying to undermine climate policy, to set credible climate targets aligned with the Paris Agreement, and to link their executive compensation to emissions reductions. On the reinvestment side, we want to see a massive reinvestment in just inclusive climate solutions. And then respecting Indigenous rights, I'm not aware of any of these funds having an Indigenous rights policy. I'm not aware of any of them having Indigenous representation on their board or governance structure. And none of them have a policy that restrict investments in companies that are violating the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. So we actually want to see these Indigenous rights policies taken up by these pension funds. Some progress so far, and this is credit to a group in Quebec called Sortons la Casse, but the CDPQ has moved the fastest. They committed to end investment in oil producers and oil pipelines by the end of this year, so they're going to divest from oil producers. They've also committed to end financing for coal. And they were the first to set a net zero commitments with obviously a varying level of credibility. We saw the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan set a net zero commitment last year and sets the strongest emissions intensity reduction targets in the fall. And then just recently, we saw some other of the big funds, Canada Pension Plan, HOOP, IMCO, and OMERS, set their own net zero commitments. I do want to note that there's a pretty big credibility gap here as far as these plans go to actually achieving that. Some of them in some cases are only a press release. Others are just a line in their annual report. So it is a high level commitment, but we actually don't think that they've done the work internally to align their portfolios with the climate safe future. We think we're making progress and we have funds attention. But I will note that not a single Canadian pension fund is yet committed to full fossil fuel divestment, including that one in Quebec. And not a single one, like I mentioned, has a policy on Indigenous rights. This is some work from Corporate Knights and the Smart Prosperity Institute that came out last fall. And it actually shows that had these giant pension funds divested 10 years ago, their returns would have been higher. So I just think this speaks enough for itself, that their public equities portfolio would have grown at a greater rate. So there would have been better returns for beneficiaries had they gotten fossil fuels out of their portfolio 10 years ago. This is just a roundup of Canadian university fossil fuel divestment commitments. I mentioned that kind of trickle turning into a wave. And we're seeing a lot of Ontario action in the last year or so committing to divestment. So it speaks to the good work that folks are doing on campus. And like I said, I highlighted here Guelph and Toronto because they're two of the 4 member universities of the University Pension Plan. And we think that the UPP should honor those commitments that have already been made by their member universities. And I also know with the UPP that they do plan on growing. So they're talking about bringing Wilfrid Laurier under the UPP umbrella. And I think they want to eventually bring more and more universities in Ontario underneath that portfolio. So by getting campus divestment commitments, we're actually helping the UPP move faster on its climate policies too. And then just some shameless self-promotion. If you go to shiftyourpension.ca, you can send a letter to your pension fund now. I know a lot of folks on the call, I can recognize their names, have already done this, but we do have UPP on this tool. And if you're not a member of the UPP, you might be a member of the other pension funds in Ontario, and we're all members of the Canada Pension Plan. So you can send a letter to those funds, and it really helps with Shift, not just getting that correspondence to the pension funds, but allowing us to follow up with you with news updates and future opportunities for action. So I hope that sets the frame a little bit of where the divestment landscape is in Canada is on pensions and universities. And I'll leave it at that for now. So thanks for taking a few minutes just to go through that quick presentation.
Thank you, Patrick. I feel like that really helps give some context to how this is important, not just at universities, but also to anyone living and working here, and how the UPP's so far refusal to divest really plays into a larger narrative. And I just, since we're starting this conversation about what was missing from what we've seen so far from U of T and what has to come next after the commitment to divest the endowment, I wanted to pick up on one thing you mentioned, which is the credibility gap that we've seen from some of these pension funds that have made commitments. One thing I've learned about, and that I know some of the people who are here today have done research into or are aware of, is that the divestment activism at U of T actually goes back to the 1980s with the student-led movement for the school to divest from South African apartheid. So there was a student group in the 80s called the Anti-Apartheid Network, and they spent basically an entire decade, very similar to what we've seen with the fossil fuel divestment movement, calling on the university to divest. And so it took years and years and years for the administration to even engage with those students and with the faculty and community members that eventually came to be involved as well. And even after that engagement, even after the commitment, which didn't come until 1988, there was still another several years of activism that it took to get the university to actually follow through and honor that commitment, as we've been talking about. So this, I think the idea of a credibility gap and what Paul spoke to earlier with the lack of transparency that we see regarding investments is a really important thing that's has been missing from the conversation. I think this is true for anyone who tries to engage in conversations about divestment, but especially for students, especially for undergraduate students where people are graduating, and so there's a pretty high turnover rate. All of the students that were involved in the original divestment campaign from fossil fuels in the early 2010s graduated, and so then LEAP had to come in and sort of reignite the campaign in 2016, 2017. And then myself, I got here in 2018, and now a lot of the people who were really active then have since graduated, and so we have new students coming in. So I think it's really important as we have this turnover to be keeping these conversations alive and also holding the university accountable to making this information more accessible. One other element that's missing beyond the pension fund from a full divestment commitment at U of T is the 3 federated colleges, Victoria, Trinity, and St. Michael's, which each have their own endowment and pension funds. They're much smaller, but they are, still significant, and especially as we're talking about social license and the sort of political and ethical implications of a divestment commitment beyond just the size of those funds. The most progress that we've made at LEAP U of T is with Victoria College, because we have several student activists who are representatives on their board of regents. But one thing that I think is really just representative and illustrative of how divestment organizing works at U of T is that on the Victoria College Board of Regents, there's a student representative on every single one of their committees except for the investment committee, because there's this assumption that students don't have the expertise or the interest or the commitment to learn about and be involved in decision making regarding the school's investments. And so I think it's really important as we're continuing these conversations and looking beyond divestment, looking at reinvestment as well, to be trying to make this information and this decision making more transparent and more accessible, especially to students, because we've seen now, not just with this movement, but going all the way back to the 80s for decades, that students do care about where our tuition money is going, where our endowment is being invested, and we should be involved in those decision-making processes. So very important stuff.
think I just want to really highlight the credibility gap that Patrick and Paul kind of alluded to in terms of language that's brought out. There's a number of things here that I can touch on as an Indigenous person. And history has, when we start reclaiming the truth in history, we start to look at like in what context our treaties were made. And I think like this is a very important aspect. And when we look at language that comes out to citizens of so-called Canada and how we are identifying these gaps right away through that credibility and through I guess like the misrepresentation of that language, because net zero is the new thing on the horizon. It's the new greenwashing term, and I specifically call it greenwashing because when I tell my kid to clean up their room, shoving all the toys underneath the bed and in the closet doesn't mean it's clean. And that's a simple analogy to help you understand that net zero doesn't mean zero. And so how are we actually achieving these emissions reductions, and who gets the subsidies for that, and business as usual. And then to the point on the economy, and this whole conversation around divestment, investment is still built on the backs of marginalized communities. It's still built on the backs, like the whole economy is built on the backs of marginalized people. It is embedded in white supremacy and patriarchy. And that's something that we need to start expanding or critically evaluating as well, is that when we start to think about like where our money is going, and money and the economy is how are we understanding the truth in that history, and how are we moving away to a just economy that is embedded in reciprocity and respect for the land. So those are just some of the things that came to mind. And then you had talked about the democratization of this investment divestment situation, and who is left out is a great conversation to start having, because at every turn we see Indigenous folks left out. And not just left out, because we talk about this a step further, because like a seat at the table doesn't mean a voice at the table. And a voice at the table doesn't mean that I am empowered to have that voice at this table. So those are some things that came to mind when all of our speakers are talking, and I do appreciate that conversation on really looking at the nuances of the language and what is being presented to people, and how we as citizens need to really start to critically evaluate what that actually means. And net zero doesn't mean zero, so this is essentially a false solution.
Thank you, everyone, for such powerful and incisive comments. I think we can just continue the conversation now, but with audience Q&A. So we'll take the next 20, 25 minutes. If people want to start putting their questions in the chat or unmute yourself, I'll be monitoring the chat while I'm waiting for questions to come in. I just want, one thing I do want to comment on is just, yeah, this point you've all been raising around language, and it feels like it's a perpetual challenge for organizers, is the line between neoliberal co-optation and truly radical transformative change is often quite fine. And when is it that we're winning because our narrative is now becoming mainstream? And when is it that the language, the discourse has been adopted, but the entire thrust of the argument is now stripped and it's lost all meaning, it's just pretty language? And it's sometimes very hard to distinguish, because sometimes institutions will be using all the correct words, but not backing it up with substance. So, I mean, that's one question I have, is how do you distinguish between the two? How do you, especially in a crisis like climate change that is so interconnected with so many issues, how do we maintain that precision and even know what are we talking about the same thing? I see there is one question though in the chat already, so maybe I'll read this one. I'll start with this one. So Colin asks, grateful for anyone's time. He has a question saying, polling shows more than half of Ontarians think we're reopening too fast, but the absence of a social license to remove public health protections at this pace seems to be no barrier to this policy trajectory. How does a data point like this integrate into theories of change that depends on revoking social license or otherwise changing public opinion?
I'm not super qualified to speak to this, but I do have a couple of thoughts. This is a great question and a great thing to be thinking about. I think I mentioned earlier that what we've seen with the pandemic, and with also what was mentioned earlier, the speed with which we've seen divestment decisions being made with regards to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, is that we can have, this sort of crisis-based, emergency-based, the speed with which our governments and our institutions are not usually willing to move. So I think as that happens, and as we see that, as we see what's possible in that regard, looking at what that could mean for the climate crisis is really important, and looking at what that could mean in terms of how those decisions are being made, are they being made responsibly, and whose voices are being taken into account is also really important. So yeah, with things like this, where the decisions that are being made don't reflect the public opinion and don't reflect what is feeling, like safe and socially licensed for most of us who live in Ontario, I think that is just bringing more awareness to what we've been talking about on this call in terms of democratization and transparency of decision making. So it's when we're talking about social license as a basis for change, I don't think anyone is under the illusion that the decisions made by our institutions are always going to reflect what the public wants or what the majority of people think and agree with. That historically has not been the case, and I unfortunately probably won't be for the foreseeable future. I think conversations around social license, especially when it comes to the climate crisis, are more about the bringing it to the level where it's not just individuals, it's at the level where it's undeniable at the institutional and governmental level. So with the pandemic, this has been really hard because everyone is so isolated and there's so much uncertainty around the public health element of it. I wish that we were not reopening this fast. I wish I were in more of a position of power to do something about that. But I think when we're looking at something that is so long term, as the climate crisis has been, but also so urgent, I think that we want the conversations about shifting social license away from reliance on fossil fuels and away from the false solutions that people have been talking about on this call. We need that to be not just having these like individual conversations, but moving it to the level of the institution, of the decision-making powers. And I'm not totally sure how that happens. I would love to hear other people's thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm particularly qualified to answer this question either, but I would say, just to pick up on one thing Rivka said about social license, I think that often social movements are ahead of our politics, and people are ahead of our governments. And I take your point about loosening COVID safety measures earlier than people want them to as a good example. But I think that it's a process. Like we're still in the process of removing the oil and gas industry's social license to operate. We haven't done it yet. It's still too much a part of our lives, and I think that what we need to move toward is policy change. It's one thing to have a movement of people pushing for something, but we need to actually entrench those changes in laws, and I don't think we've done that yet. I think that the divest movement is helping us push it in that direction. But the removal of social license, I think comes before our governments acting, and we need to elect better governments in that case via the social movements we've built, like divestment. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but I'm having trouble answering it any other way.
Just want to add to, I think when we think about like what the pandemic has taught us and how fast policy has moved in response to the pandemic, it's looking at the hypocrisy of these types of conversations. So the hypocrisy in our own selves and how we move forward to do a just transition, right? So when I talk about divestment or just transition or climate change or anything in this realm of conversation, a lot of times people will go, well, you still drive a car, Rebecca. So it's really addressing these hypocrisies that we have within ourselves. And the pandemic showed that quite heavily, right? Where we've seen federal officials, jetting off to vacation. And then we see how, you can take a mask off while you're eating, but put it back on when you're done eating because there's like no COVID on the food. And we start to see like this imbalance of hypocrisy that we're not addressing in this social atmosphere. So that's something that I had noticed that's similar to like how we are taught from our 7 sacred teachings and in humility, and being humble. So it's not to say that we have all the answers, but to say that I have the humility to look for the answer, to have conversations about what this looks like. And I think when we have, Amanda had talked a little bit about this, when we have these issues of social change, or these groups that want to have change, and the language that we're putting forth and stuff like that, we can mimic that through nature and have the biodiversity of people to ensure that that language is spread across. So that's where I see a lot of policy decisions that are being made with the exemption of good minds that can come together to actually make this change happen. And we continuously perpetuate that, right, in our social change, and in our policy making, in our board members, in our decision making models. It's still perpetuated as smaller minds that continue the status quo as usual. So those are some of the thoughts that I came up with when I was looking at that, because that is a hefty question, I just want to say.
Amazing. I don't know if others want to jump in there, but I'll also just read another question that's come in from Christy here. So it says, do any of the panelists have any contact with or specific comment on engagement initiatives such as the University Network for Investor Engagement, UNIE, of which UTAM is a member?
Maybe I'll say something quickly about that. There's a lot of talk you'll see about this idea of investor engagement. Staying at the table with various fossil fuel companies, for example, by keeping your investments in them in an effort to change their policy. There are many such initiatives. There's a lot of that language out there. I think that we in the divestment community, what we have to say is, where is the evidence that investor engagement is having any significant impact on the decisions of major companies? Because there is very, very little evidence out there to suggest that investors are really influencing the policy of these companies. And certainly investors like the University of Toronto do not have the power, just as investors, to go and tell ExxonMobil what to do. They not only do they not have that power, but because of the investment model whereby they're using managers who are investing for their managers, the sort of manager of manager process, whereby the university itself is actually 2 or 3 steps removed from the actual investments often. There's no way in which the University of Toronto is sitting at the table engaging with these major companies. So I think once again, we have to be very suspicious about the language of investor engagement as an excuse for continuing to invest in questionable companies.
I can share a few thoughts on this as well, because it comes up a lot with our work on pension funds, and all of them say that they prefer engagements over divestments without that real evidence on climate in particular that Paul is talking about. And I always come back and say that it's always framed as engagement versus divestment. And I really think it should be engagement and divestment, or even divestment as parts of an effective engagement policy. I really think of engagement as kind of the carrot, where you do maybe hold shares in the company and hold meetings with them and use your proxy voting power to move them in the right direction. But there needs to be a stick. And the stick is divestment. There needs to be a timeline and an expectation set with that. And I don't see that always happening when it comes to fossil fuels in particular. I'd also say that engagement has been effective on other issues. If you think about improving the governance of a company, or ensuring that they have more people of color and women on their board, or improving labor rights at some of their companies and assets, I think that there's clear evidence that that engagement has actually improved corporate behavior in some of those areas. But for fossil fuels, there's no pathway to decarbonization for an oil producer. I think there's a difference there, where if you're an oil and gas company, your reason for existence is extracting fossil fuels from the ground and eventually refining and burning them. So I don't know how you can engage your way out of that problem. The other thing I'll say here is, especially for smaller investors that really don't have a lot of clout if they're using their proxy voting power or joining investor coalitions like university endowment funds, there's been a few examples of smaller pension funds saying, we finally got the time of day of companies, we finally got the attention of these big corporations when we divested. That's when they've actually, the companies is like, whoa, like these guys divested, now we want to talk to them. So I don't think that divesting actually precludes a company from a pension fund or an investor from engaging the companies in the portfolio. You can still engage them and use user influence to change their behavior without holding shares in the company or without owning them. So I really think this whole debate is a false dichotomy, and divestment should be the logical end of a robust, effective engagement policy once it's failed. And we've seen some pension fund leaders do that, where they've actually given companies a 2 or 3 year timeline to say, make these changes or we'll divest. And then they followed through and divested when the companies didn't. For oil and gas in particular, I think the questions they should be asking is like, do you have a credible decarbonization pathway? Are you giving your executives and staff bonuses for increasing production? Do you have a just transition plan for your workers? Do you have an indigenous rights policy? Are you allocating capital toward renewables and other climate solutions instead of capital toward expanding your oil and gas operations? I can't think of any examples of oil and gas companies that are doing those things. So I just really think the whole engagement route falls apart for the fossil fuel sector in particular, even though it might be really effective for other sectors of the economy.
Wonderful. I don't know if others want to jump in there, but I think that's given us a lot to think about and to work with. I'm going to read another question from Millen. And Millen actually was one of the very first divestment organizers. He was around working on divestment in 2012 before when I was still in high school. So I just want to give a shout out to him, because I learned so much from him back when I was a teenager too, and now. So Millen says, achieving climate change mitigation requires policies that carry on from government to government. How can we get into a position where such cross-partisan support exists and parties won't capitalize on promises to remove unpopular taxes and regulations meant to control climate change?
Investing in Indigenous sovereignty, I think, is a oversimplification of an answer for you. But at the same time, I think like when we think about the way our governments move, and I'm not talking about Indian Act Chief and Council here, I'm talking about hereditary chiefs that have generational wealth and family in their sovereignty and in their understanding of this land. I think when we invest in those kinds of leadership qualities, we'll start to see meaningful change that is not politically sensitive.
I think that's a really good point. And I also want to go back to something that Rebecca, you brought up earlier about the day-to-day tangible impacts of emissions mitigation policies and taxes and things like that on marginalized communities, on working class communities. You mentioned gas prices, which is something we're seeing a lot right now. But really, any of these policies that we're considering, including what we do with our investments and where we're reinvesting that, we need to be taking into account what that actually means for the lived experiences and the tangible, like financial consequences on the communities who are most impacted by the climate crisis. And I think that if we are taking that into consideration as we're making these decisions, and as we are deciding what we want the goals of our campaigns to be, what we want the focus of our organizing to be, and also whose voices we are including in that organizing and in those conversations, in that decision making, I think the more that we can take into account the people who are most impacted and most hurt by the climate crisis and by fossil fuel extraction, the hopefully more like sustainable and long lasting those changes will be.
Yeah, I think this is another big question. And just to start, I think I would echo what Rebecca said. If we really are serious about protecting nature, protecting our future, ending carbon emissions, we need to empower Indigenous communities. They've been probably the most effective group of people that have stopped fossil fuel expansion projects in the last 10 years. And we need to do more of that, and we need to empower them to do so. So I would put that out there. This question is really interesting as well, because I think that a lot of the policies that have been used so far in Canada to reduce emissions have had this effect of having more of an impact on marginalized people, of outlining the individual costs of action while kind of letting the bigger polluters off the hook. Yesterday, we just saw the emissions reduction plan, which has some pretty good policies, like across transportation, across agriculture, across buildings, across the electricity sector. But within that plan, they're actually allowing tar sands production to increase tar sands emissions by 56% by 2030. So it means that we're letting the oil and gas sector grow their emissions for the next 8 years, and it puts more pressure on every other sector and individual to do more to pick up for that slack. So I really think we need to reassess how we're addressing this problem, how we're reducing emissions, to make sure that it's actually the polluters that are paying for it and not individuals and marginalized communities that are bearing the brunt of it. And finally, I think a really important part here, and this goes to some of the asks we have of pension funds with their engagement strategy, is lobbying. It's very clear to me that oil and gas companies and their industry associations, which they're members of, have their fingerprints all over climate and energy policy in every province in this country and within the federal government. We saw it again yesterday in this emissions reduction plan. And if we want to sap the power of this industry, we need to do something about the excessive lobbying to weaken, delay, obstruct, and undermine climate policy in this country. I think it's a critical point that we need to address if we have any chance of meeting our climate targets.
Would anyone else like to jump in on this question? Otherwise, I can raise some others. Okay, so this might be our last, this might be the last question. So I'm just going to pause, see if anyone wants to ask one in the chat. Otherwise, I will go ahead. But I think one thing I'm thinking about hearing all of these discussions and as someone who's still working the climate justice movement is this challenge of having like clear and focused and winnable campaigns, which I think is something that Divestment did, but that also speak to everything that's involved. I really liked what Rebecca was saying earlier around Anishinaabe ceremonies and teachings and this web, right? And thinking of climate change as this problem that's situated within broader matrices of power, that it is connected to extractive capitalism, to white supremacy, to settler colonialism. So, you know, especially if there are young activists perhaps here on this call thinking about this, like how do we develop future campaigns that can find that sweet spot, that are going to inspire people because it feels achievable, winnable, tangible, but it's also going to speak to the huge complex web that we're working with the climate crisis. And I just asked you probably the most difficult question ever, so leave it to answer however you like, and I think it's something we can all continue thinking about too.
Yeah, I didn't hear a question in there though. I think when we talk about this web and this interconnected relationship that we have, right at the center of all of this, and sorry, I just got a notification. I have a hard stop at 11. Right at the center of this, when we start to look at like mimicking nature and biodiversity in our teams and our boards and all of these types of things. None of this stuff is going to work without the decolonization of our individual selves. And that's where we need to start. So it can't be this broad, like it can be, but simultaneously we need to have that same discourse within ourselves. And I was talking with a young Métis youth, Brianne Lavely-Heckert, who is a co-founder of Red River Echoes here in the prairies. We were talking about decolonization and relationships and engagement with Indigenous communities. And she really brought this moment of clarity, right? So what does decolonization mean? And it's really like dismantling our own privilege and power structures within ourselves. And that's not to say that I don't have decolonial work that I need to do within myself too. So that I think like when we start to do that work within our inherent selves and expand that beyond, we get those teachings in Indigenous worldview as well, right? Like we have a center, we have ourselves that we have a responsibility to, but we also have all of these other responsibilities that we're taking hold of. And it's not to feel like I have the weight of the world on my shoulders, but uplifting us to knowing that we have a responsibility and a connection and a relationship. And I think like oftentimes in this like capitalistic kind of world, we'll feel dragged down. We'll feel like these are peanuts compared to what we need to accomplish in this world. And it'll make us feel like this emergent or crisis kind of behavior. In an Indigenous worldview, we really look at recentering ourselves in like what our mission is individually and what that responsibility is outwardly, and allowing ourselves to understand that there's only so much we can do as an individual and that collective is important. So those are kind of my thoughts when we start to think about like social change, when we start to think about capital change, is the decolonization that's required from each and every one of us. So we can't just have policy that says this. Can't just have policy that says reconciliation, and decolonization moves beyond just Indigenous folks. It's into the broader BIPOC community, into the murdered missing Indigenous women conversation, right? It's understanding what that means to us individually.
Yeah, I definitely don't have an answer to this. I think what Rebecca just said is really wise. I have just like a much smaller scale thought in response to how do we, have these like very goal-oriented movements while that are also like including and appealing to a broader range of people. I think it's really important that we build in like moments and practices of community building and self-reflection into our activist spaces and into our organizing spaces. So one thing that's looked like in LEAP is just like a really simple book club, just having an opportunity to read authors like Robin Wall Kimmerer, James Baldwin, Angela Davis, and focus on issues that maybe aren't at the center of our like tangible get the university to divest its endowment, so that we can have those goals, have those tangible actions, but still be learning and growing and building connections and communities within ourselves for what will hopefully build into longer term movement building.
Yeah, agree with both those answers, and I'll try to squeeze a couple things in quickly and scale out a bit here. One thing I want to see more campaigning on in Canada in terms of fossil finance campaigns is insurance companies. There's some really good work going on in the US and Europe and the UK right now that are targeting insurance companies which have this mandate of holding massive investment portfolios, but also providing insurance to homes and infrastructure that are obviously already being decimated by the climate crisis. So they're in this really weird position where they need to pay out an increasingly greater amount of money to people that are losing their businesses, their homes, their infrastructure because of climate change, but also investing in the companies that are causing the problems. So I think they're a really ripe target for this kind of fossil finance campaigning. It's already happening to some extent out west with a couple organizations trying to pick off insurers that are providing insurance coverage to the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline. It drives up the cost of capital, drives up the cost of insurance, reduces their options. And I really think that insurance companies are a very tangible target that campaigners within Canada can take. And just on Indigenous reconciliation, in terms of pension funds, I really think that there's a conversation that needs to happen about land back, where these pension funds are massive owners of the real economy. They own utilities, huge tracts of real estate, sustainable agricultural lands, farmland, timberlands, massive assets, massive holdings in the real economy. And if we're going to go down this conversation about Indigenous reconciliation and what decolonization looks like, we need to answer we need to start asking the question about how are these assets providing benefits or compensation to the lands on where Indigenous people have lived for centuries. And it might open up a door to having a conversation about land back, where if they are operating these assets, if they are owning these offsets on unceded Indigenous territory, then how are the people that have lived there for centuries benefiting from those pension investments that are making returns? So I think that's one area of campaigning on pensions that's those questions start needing to be asked in terms of this country's conversation about reconciliation.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to have to just wrap it up there. Apologies for my tardy timekeeping at the end here. This conversation could just continue on forever, but thank you so much to the panelists, to the Committee on the Environment and Climate Change and Sustainability for being here, for making this event possible. Christy has put in the chat information about the upcoming award ceremony and innovation prize pitch, and you can find information about further panels. I'm also going to drop to just in the chat, this actually became available during this panel, but there's a timeline I was working on in part with people on this call that goes over the entire divestment campaign at U of T. And so I just wanted to share that here for the first time with others to maybe give some hope for other people too, that this is sometimes decades lifelong work, and you don't have to have all the weight on your shoulders, right? We're passing the torch, we're continually building, learning, decolonizing ourselves, as Rebecca was telling us. So I hope we can all continue to learn from the beautiful work that happened at U of T divestment and the beautiful work that's going to continue to happen on and off campus in the broader fight for climate justice. So thank you so much. This session is going to be recorded and posted on the website, and yeah, have a wonderful day.